It's one of France's best-known cheeses, rivaling Roquefort and Brie. It claims to originate during the French Revolution in rural Normandy, spreading throughout France thanks to the construction of railways. It would come to feed French soldiers in the trenches of World War I, and all the stories about its origins would seal its place in the imagination of France and the world. Let's learn about the history of Camembert. Hey there, cheese historians! I'm Julia and welcome to Cheese History, a channel all about the origins, history and impact of cheese. Today it's the turn of Camembert, the smaller cousin of Brie, which I covered in a previous video. Do check that video out if you're interested in the differences between the two French white mold ripened cheeses and the history of Brie itself. Camembert appears to have one of the most clear-cut origin stories of any cheese I've looked at so far. However, there are some serious questions around whether it actually happened. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of this video looking at the two parts of the origin story, the invention of Camembert and how it spread and became famous throughout France. Once that's out the way, I'll look into several other key events in the history of Camembert that help explain how it came to be the cheese that we know today. A little bit of a side note, there are a lot of French words in this episode and I'm going to try to pronounce them as best I can. Your patience and understanding are appreciated. According to its origin story, Camembert was first made about 230 years ago in Normandy, France. Lore holds that Marie Harel, a farm wife in the tiny village of Camembert in Normandy, France, sheltered a priest fleeing the revolutionary loyalty oath in 1791. In gratitude, he taught her the cheese-making technique used in his former parish, Brie, and Harel cleverly married it to the local cheese-making methods to create Camembert. Her descendants carried on the tradition, and her grandson, Victor Painel, allegedly introduced it to Napoleon III, bringing it to the nation. According to the story, what made Harel's Camembert distinct from the Brie the priest knew how to make was that she used a different, smaller mold to shape the cheese. It was a mold normally used to make Norman Livarot cheese. This makes sense because Camembert is a lot smaller than Brie, and the difference in size means the two cheeses ripen at different rates, meaning the end result is different. So is there any truth to this story of a French farm wife being taught a cheese recipe by an on-the-run priest? There was a woman named Marie Fontaine who was born in Creutz on the 28th of April 1761 and briefly lived in Camembert before she married Jacques Harel in 1785 and moved to Roville, which is not very far from Camembert. So we know that a woman named Marie Harel was in the general area of Camembert at the right time. Looking good so far. What about the fleeing priest? For a bit of context, Camembert's origin story takes place during the French Revolution, which set up France as a secular state, doing away with the monarchy and attempting to control the Catholic Church. The Catholic clergy had to swear an oath of loyalty to this new regime if they wanted to remain in their positions and be paid, as they would now be paid by the state. Many Catholic priests were reluctant to swear this oath in case it conflicted with their obligations to the Catholic Church and to the Pope. So a priest fleeing from Brie, which is close to the French capital Paris, and going towards the Normandy coast could well have passed through Camembert. In fact, several did just that. One priest passed through the nearby village of Vimoutiers and was lynched by the inhabitants for refusing to take the oath of loyalty, so it didn't always go well for the priest. There were also accounts of at least 3 slightly more fortunate priests who were sheltered for a time in Camembert. While any of them could be the priest in Camembert's origin story, there's no direct evidence that they are. Okay, so we don't have any evidence for the priest being sheltered by Harel and teaching her to make Camembert outside of the cheese's origin story. But the story does fit with the political situation in France at the time, so that doesn't mean that there wasn't such a priest, just that we can't know for sure that this happened. We do know that Marie Harel was a real person living near Camembert in 1891, but did she invent Camembert cheese? Unfortunately, it looks like the answer to that question is that depends on how you interpret the evidence. The earliest reference to cheese from Camembert is from 1708 in a geographical dictionary by Thomas Corneille, based on the notes he took in 1702. A sizable town of Basse Normandie in the Diocese of Lisieux and 6 leagues from that city, and approximately 2 from Fervach and Livarot, above Montgomery, in the river called La Vie, A large market is held each Monday, where excellent Livarot and Camembert cheeses can be found. It's mentioned again in 1760 by Charles Jobey, the mayor of Orbec, when discussing the market at Pont-l'Évêque. There they sell many cheeses called augelots, which are not as large nor as good. None as rich as Livarot or Camembert cheese. Sounds like evidence that Camembert predates Harel by almost a century, doesn't it? A brief caveat is necessary here. The downside to having cheeses named after the town they come from or the market they are sold in, as is quite common with European cheeses, is that it doesn't tell us anything about what those cheeses are like. While these earlier references to Camembert do imply that cheese comes from that town, they don't describe what it was like, so it's hard to say for sure that there was already a bloomy rind cheese being produced in Camembert almost 100 years before the Camembert origin story claims Marie Harel was taught the techniques by a passing priest. However, as Camembert was already highly acclaimed before Harel, it would have been surprising if she did indeed manage to supplant and take over the name of a well-known local delicacy. If the cheese mentioned by these earlier sources is indeed an early form of Camembert, that doesn't mean that Harel had no role at all in creating the cheese that we know and love today. She may well have refined Camembert by making small changes so it became the cheese we know today, even if it predates her. Alternatively, she may have been very good at making an already excellent local cheese. On the balance of things, I think the story that Camembert originates with Harel is a myth, but at the very least she was very good at making the already existing local cheese of Camembert and possibly refined it. So if the story of Camembert's origin is a myth, where did it come from? To explain this, it's necessary to look to Marie Harel's descendants. Family tree time. Marie and Jacques Harel had one daughter, also named Marie Harel. The younger Marie married Thomas Pinel, and they had 5 children, 2 daughters and 3 sons. It seems the elder Marie Harel passed her cheese-making techniques onto her daughter, who passed them on to her children, at least 4 of whom were in the cheese-making business, making Camembert. It was these descendants who made sure everyone knew that their grandmother invented Camembert. The first printed matter crediting Marie Harel, née Fontaine, with the invention of Camembert appeared around 1850. It was the product of the grandchildren at the Norman farm, led by her grandson, Cyril Pinel. And why would Harel's grandchildren want everyone to know that their grandmother invented Camembert? Because it's great for business. They were making and selling Camembert and wanted everyone who bought it to know that they were getting the real deal. The proper, authentic Harel Camembert made using the same methods their grandmother had supposedly used during the Revolution. So we know that cheese from Camembert was well known almost 100 years before Marie Harel has claims to have invented Camembert, and that the earliest claims that she did invent it seem to come from her grandchildren, who were Camembert makers who had commercial reasons to tell the world their grandmother invented Camembert. As for who first really made it and when, we'll probably never know. I certainly couldn't find much information about Camembert before the French Revolution. In my video on the history of Brie, I mentioned that one of the reasons Brie became so well known was because the town of Brie is close to Paris, where Brie cheese was sold as a delicacy to the wealthy people of Europe. Unlike Brie, the town of Camembert is a long way from Paris, so its distribution was largely limited to Normandy until the railway system was expanded in the 1850s and 60s, enabling Camembert to be shipped by rail en masse to Paris. A 3-day coach journey was reduced to 6 hours, which is a huge difference to a soft cheese like Camembert. The railways also feature in Camembert's origin story, where they are crucial to helping Camembert's popularity grow by giving the cheese an imperial seal of approval. In 1863, at the train station at Sourdon in the Orne, Marie Harel's grandson, Victor Pinel, served one of his Camemberts to Emperor Napoleon III. The emperor found the cheese much to his liking, congratulated its producer, invited him to his palace, the Tuileries, and requested that he deliver the product to him on a regular basis. It seems to me that this story has a lot in common with the bishop who fed Emperor Charlemagne Brie and was also instructed to supply the emperor with Brie, which I talked about in more detail in my episode on Brie. Okay, a few centuries have passed, so there is a train, but most other details in both stories seem to broadly parallel each other. It may be a total coincidence, but I got a little bit suspicious. So I wasn't too surprised when Pierre, who has written a whole book on Camembert's origin story, argued that this could not have happened in 1863, as the train line to Sedan was not completed until 1867. While Napoleon III was in Normandy in 1863, it was for a horse racing event. So it looks like it's unlikely that a chance meeting between Victor Pinel and Napoleon III had much to do with the growing popularity of Camembert, because it probably didn't happen. The element of truth in the story is that the railway did help Camembert become more popular. It allowed Camembert to be transported quickly to markets in Paris and beyond, giving it a much wider population of potential Camembert eaters. This expansion also had its downsides. It meant that the Camembert producers had to trust others to sell their products in the larger cities, and there were instances of many underhand practices by these middlemen. One of these involved the paper wrappers that Camembert were transported in. Because Camembert is a small and quite fragile cheese, they're wrapped in paper to protect them. The paper wrappers also allowed the cheesemakers to label their cheese, so their customers would know they were getting the real deal. Some of the more unscrupulous cheese sellers were buying back the wrappers from the person who bought the cheese, so the seller could wrap a different or inferior cheese in them and sell them as Camembert. Such underhand practices showed that Camembert was becoming a well-known cheese, which was exactly what Marie Harel's descendants wanted. Even though the story of the railway and the emperor is probably not true, it is clear that Marie Harel's descendants, particularly her grandsons Victor and Cyril Pinel, were exceptionally good at marketing their cheese, letting the legend of how their grandmother was given the method by a fleeing monk from Brie and how it was loved by Napoleon III capture the imagination of France. Their industriousness and clever marketing wasn't just about selling more cheese. It was also an attempt to ensure they had exclusive rights to produce the cheese, which was being threatened from all sides after the 1850s. The other downside to shipping Camembert to Paris via the railway was that as Camembert's popularity skyrocketed after 1850, so did the desire to get in on the action. Soon there were Camembert producers throughout Normandy and even other parts of France. At that time, anyone could make a cheese and call it Camembert. But the consumers weren't stupid. They knew which brands produced the good stuff. So the competitors of Marie Harel's descendants tried to get hold of the secrets of making high-quality Camembert by hiring women who had worked for the Pinels and learning how it was done from them. The Pinels did everything they could to retain control over their cheese, including trying to force all other producers to label their cheese imitation Camembert. It didn't really work though, and the influence of Harel's descendants slowly began to decline. In 1909, a collection of Camembert cheesemakers from Normandy, including Harel's descendants, but not dominated by them, formed the Syndicat des Fabricants du Véritable Camembert de Normandie, or SFVCN, to save you all from my terrible French pronunciation. In 1910, the syndicate tried to get Camembert official designation of origin, which would mean it could only be made in Normandy, but this failed. So instead, the Camembert cheesemakers of Normandy went heavily into marketing their product as better than their competitors. At this point in the 20th century, Camembert was a cheese known mainly in the cities. That was all to change during the turbulent years between 1914 and 1918. The next great marketing step for Camembert came during the Great War. Throughout almost the entire conflict from 1914 to 1918, the majority of the French army was stationed on the Western Front, which cut through the French countryside and Belgium. The French were fighting on home soil, but in the hellish conditions of trench warfare. During the Great War, the French army was about 2 million men strong, which is a lot of mouths to feed. Cheese was one of the foods supplied, and the makers of Camembert wanted to get in on the action. Initially, Gruyere and Cantal were the cheeses used to supply the troops, which weren't as delicate as Camembert, so were easier to transport and store. However, the SFVCN, the Syndicate of Norman Camembert Cheesemakers, after lots of schmoozing, managed to convince the army in 1917 that they should be the main cheese supplier. The small, soft cheeses were packaged in their distinctive wooden box, which first appeared in 1890, and helped protect them from the trials of transport. It also provided an opportunity to put morale-boosting labels on the boxes to encourage the troops to keep on fighting. It was even named Le Camembert de la Victoire, Victory Camembert, for additional patriotic effect. After the war, Camembert became France's most popular cheese. in part due to the superb marketing move by the Camembert syndicate to supply its cheese to the troops and remind the nation of a time they all banded together to overcome the trials of trench warfare. In case you're thinking of joining the French army to secure a supply of Camembert, think again, as it's no longer part of the standard soldier rations, replaced by types of cheese that are cheaper, mass-produced, and easily transported and stored. Practicality won out in the end. After the war was over, the Camembert makers of Normandy still had the same problem as before: how to stop cheesemakers in other parts of France selling their cheese as Camembert, and profiting off all the hard work they had done to market their cheese to all of France. Now they had additional problems too, as international competitors, particularly in Denmark, were also beginning to make Camembert. Imitation seems to have been a problem for Camembert throughout its history, one that it still has today, as Camembert is made all over the world. The Camembert makers needed a way to combat this and to reclaim Camembert for Normandy. What ended up happening was that they cemented the story of how the cheese was invented. It was by chance that they found a way to do so, with a monument to its alleged inventor. After World War I, the myth of Camembert's origins had been fading away, with less and less people aware of the story, most likely because Harel's descendants were no longer so dominant in the cheese-making industry. So it was a bit of a surprise when, in 1926, an American named Dr. Joseph Knirrim arrived in Vimoutiers, a village near Camembert in Normandy, seeking to lay a wreath on the grave of the woman who invented Camembert, which was the only food he could eat during a particularly bad months-long bout of indigestion. After a bit of searching, the family tomb of Marie Harel was located, and before he left, Dr. Knirrim made a contribution of $20 towards erecting a monument in honor of Harel to the deputy mayor of Vimoutiers, who arranged for such a monument to be built in his town. The monument was completed 2 years later, in 1928, immortalizing the myth of a French peasant woman who first created Camembert. The Knirrim effect is not to be measured in kilograms of Camembert sold, but rather by its impact on the sphere of the imagination, in the realm of symbolism. The celebration of Marie Harel, the inventor who was reinvented after 130 years of obscurity, was to change the image of her cheese. Although by the 1920s, Camembert was already the most widely consumed cheese in France, it was still but one among many. It may have been the most familiar, but it was also one of the least prestigious, a plebeian cheese in comparison to Roquefort, which could boast of a 2,000-year lineage. The glorification of its creator gave Camembert a unique status that set it apart from other cheeses and made it stand out. From that time on, it acquired a personality of its own. Its popularity piqued the interests of the French, who wanted to know about Marie Harel and the circumstances surrounding her invention. This increase in interest about Harel meant that information and stories about her were found, and if they couldn't be found, it looks like things were just made up. Over time, the myth changed and developed to become the one that we're familiar with today. Unfortunately, the statue of Harel was damaged when the Allies accidentally bombed Vimoutiers on June 14, 1944. An American cheese factory in Ohio offered to fund the town's reconstruction, and a new statue was unveiled in 1954. Even though the statue was replaced, Camembert faced a new challenge: pasteurization. Pasteurization is the process of heating usually liquid foods like wine, milk, and juice to kill off harmful bacteria so they last longer. It was discovered in the 1860s by Louis Pasteur. With milk, it's used to kill all the harmful bacteria present, particularly those that cause tuberculosis. The temperatures milk is heated to and the time it remains at that temperature vary, with the general rule being that the lower the temperature, the longer the milk has to be held at that temperature. Pasteurization impacts the quality of cheese produced from pasteurized milk, as it eliminates the helpful bacteria as well as the harmful ones, many of which are local to the particular area or type of milk-producing animal and contribute to the unique flavors of a particular cheese. In order to make cheese from pasteurized milk, lactic bacteria have to be added back into the milk at the start of cheese making. Before the 1950s, pasteurization was common for drinking milk, but not so much for cheese-making milk. However, in the same period, post the Second World War, many cheese factories were also introducing industrial methods, replacing the armies of cheesemakers with machinery, allowing them to increase their productivity. While Camembert had been made on a massive scale up to this point, it was largely being made by hand. This began to change. Between 1950 and 1960, Camembert became an industrial product, and the world of traditional cheesemaking virtually disappeared. Its collapse took some 25 years, from 1955 to 1980, a quarter century that witnessed the annihilation of a century-old network of interwoven local activities. The change went hand in hand with similar innovations in farming, especially in cattle raising. The Norman countryside, with the exception of the Plains region, had remained practically unchanged for more than 100 years. After the Second World War, changes took place with lightning speed and affected everything. Pasteurisation was brought in by some large industrial Camembert factories in the 1950s, as it allowed them to control the quality of the cheese produced by controlling the bacteria added back into the milk at the start of cheesemaking. The milk would also last longer once pasteurized, so milk from further away from the factory could also be used without the risk of it becoming too acidic before it reached the factory. The combination of pasteurization and industrialization meant that the cost of making Camembert decreased in the industrial factories, but not in those that employed more traditional methods, with cheesemakers doing everything by hand. Many of the traditional factories were unable to compete, and either adopted some of the industrial methods in pasteurization or went out of business in the 1960s. Only a handful continued using traditional methods. In 1983, the SFVCN finally managed to get Appellation d'origine contrôlée, controlled designation of origin, for raw milk Camembert de Normandie, requiring that any cheese called Camembert de Normandie had to be made from unpasteurized milk in Normandy. Another key factor of AOC Camembert was that the curd had to be transferred into the mold with a ladle rather than more industrialized techniques. This initially meant that most Camembert de Normandie was ladled into molds by hand, but it wasn't long before a robot ladle moldler was developed, capable of ladling Camembert curds into 20 molds at a time. Camembert production could now be completely industrial, even in Normandy. Because Camembert's recipe was a closely guarded secret by the Harels, the Paynels, and other early Camembert makers of Normandy, no one really attempted to define what Camembert was until it was being made all over France, and even internationally, and was somewhat beyond the control of Normandy cheesemakers. While this lack of control meant that industrialized processes took over from the traditional ways of making it, it also meant that Camembert has changed and developed over the last 200 years. Since 1996, Camembert de Normandie became a protected designation of origin, or PDO cheese, in the European Union, specifying where and how it's made, and with what milk it has to be made in order to bear the label Camembert de Normandie. Today, Camembert is made all over the world, and can range hugely in quality depending on the exact methods and ingredients used. Even though the exact details of the origin story of Camembert are clever marketing and likely an exaggeration or fabrication of what really happened, we have that marketing to thank for ensuring the lasting popularity of this wonderful French cheese. Thanks so much for watching. A special thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for all their support. You too can support me on Patreon if you would like to help me get hold of resources like Pierre Boisard's Camembert, a National Myth, which I can recommend if you're interested in knowing more than you ever thought it was possible to know about the origin story and development of Camembert. I have only just touched the surface in this video. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and I will see you around.